everyone, and welcome back again. I hope you guys enjoyed the general overview of the Final Fantasy opening theme and the bombing mission theme that we explored last week. Today we're going to be going into more detail of how the orchestration was used and laid out, how certain instruments were placed and what they were used for, and sort of how the composer went around and got the general sound other than the use of his chordal progressions and his choice of melody and overall choice of instruments. Basically what we're going to do is we're just going to hop in and look at what are the winds doing, what are the brass doing, what are our percussion instruments doing, and what are our strings doing. General stuff, but we're going to get into a bit of a more detailed explanation of each instrument as we're going through. So as usual, we're just going to start at the top, work our way down. We're going to start with the top at the winds. Now, the last song we did a walkthrough of, which was our Breath of the Wild track, the woodwinds were mostly used as background instruments, and that is generally what they are used for in, I would say, 90% of classical orchestration, because woodwinds are a very, very great texture addition, and they also make a great texture addition in this track here, but there are a couple sections where the woodwinds are actually pushed to the forefront as opposed to what they were doing in our last composition walkthrough. Now, if you haven't listened to the recreation I did of this, I highly recommend going to look at it and listen to it, and maybe watch the previous walkthrough video we did where we explained some of the more general things. You can find links to both of those in the description below. So I highly recommend going and watch those first before coming back to this and hopping back in and following us along. Now, the woodwinds in this piece are amazingly accentuated. I love the way they added them in, and especially how they take a lot of precedence, especially in the very beginning of the track, as well as later on when they sort of introduce some of the main melodic themes. When you're listening to this piece, you would think that you're listening to a very, very large brass ensemble at the very beginning after the main sort of piano and high strings piece comes in at the very beginning, because you have the track starting off with this little bit here. So you have it starting off with tonal percussion instruments such as the piano, the glockenspiel, and the celeste, as well as some very, very high violin string lines. But then it later transitions over into this section here. Now, last week we explored some of the chordal progressions and some of the just voice line written techniques that he used to get sort of the emotional feeling here, but something we didn't quite discuss is the use of the woodwinds. Now, the woodwinds make up, I would say, 90% of this sort of uplifting section, but they kind of almost sound like the brass is at the forefront still. Now, this is what I mean when I say woodwinds are a very, very great textural addition, because you only have the trumpet here playing a similar high line as the flutes and the oboes, and you have two horn lines at the bottom, and if you solo the brass, it doesn't really sound that impressive. However, if I were to solo the brass and the woodwinds, you get a whole new texture with a lot more power behind it. And this can be said about any section that has the woodwinds playing in this track, as well as a variety of other tracks. As the song progresses and we get closer to the more heavy-hitting chunk of the opening theme, where you have that title flash across the screen and you have that very, very memorable theme. Now, the brass is, of course, at the forefront here. It is taking over everything. However, you have the woodwinds in the back playing your main sort of chordal progression, or suspended held chord, I should say, because it doesn't really progress. You have it holding this E, G, B chord here, and of course our F sharp at the top to add in a little bit of interest. And that's really all it does for this whole section. It's just holding a chord. It's adding the emotional detail that you want this section to have. However, once again, if I take it out, the entire section is so much weaker. Not really that impressive. We have a very, very amazing brass melody. However, even if we add in the strings and some of the other instruments here, you'll find it just lacks a bit of power. There's no real emotion behind it, and there's not really a lot power there anymore, even though the brass and the percussion behind it is packing quite a punch. So adding these woodwinds in and holding those chords not only gives you an amazing textural addition, but it also adds in a lot of missing detail that we absolutely need if we are to write something similar to this. And you don't really notice it until it goes missing. This can be said for a lot of the track, as the woodwinds are sort of a glue that holds everything together in a lot of compositions. We're not going to spend too long focusing on the woodwinds themselves because we also have the brass and the other sections to go through. But one thing I do want to point out is the use of melodic transitions within your instruments. So something that's very, very impressive about this track is the way that it's transitioned from a very brass-heavy melody into a woodwind melody back to brass, which they do later on. It's later on in the song, at about 2 minutes and 20 seconds in. However, if we listen to it, we can notice that the brass starts out with our main melody. The brass is our melody, the brass is our carrying force. However, they can't just repeat the brass melody over and over again. It's not very interesting. It doesn't really hold up to the theme of what we're writing for. It can get kind of boring. So they do something extremely interesting where they take the brass out completely almost, and they have it all play in the woodwinds. You can almost call it a call and response sort of melody writing technique, where they have the main sort of theme of the song come in and be played on the brass, and then they modify it a little bit, change up the orchestration a little bit, and change up the rhythm a bit, and put it in the woodwinds. And they continue this twice. They go brass, woodwinds, before they have this final sort of big rising sounds over here. So I cannot stress this enough. Orchestration is extremely important. I say this in a lot of my videos already. Use your woodwinds, use your full orchestra, because if you want to write something that has power or emotion or sounds full, if you exclude the woodwinds, a lot of times you'll find that you're just excluding a lot of your song, just overall. Now, the brass, we actually don't need to go into much detail for, because the brass for this particular piece is heavily melody-based and heavily theme-based. You'll find that in a lot of sections here, such as the very beginning when they're introducing the song, or over here when they don't really have a lot of the main theme playing, there isn't a lot of brass. However, in our big section here, we have all of the brass included. We have it all included over here where we're doing this sort of thematic rhythm section that you are very, very well familiar of if you've listened to any Final Fantasy music. course, you have that iconic brass soaring melody at the very beginning. Now, something I want to point out real quick is the use of the trumpets. Trumpets are kind of like woodwinds in the fact that a lot of beginning composers don't really think to use them that much. However, adding them in at some sort of a lower volume so that they're not really extremely annoying and present, and just mixing them in properly can be a great addition, as we can hear very well as we play the section again. If we are to take these trumpets out, this entire section loses, again, a lot of detail and a lot of movement and emotion. So one piece of advice we can glean from this is trumpets are still a great instrument to use. As you can see, though, they're not used a lot in this particular piece of music. They're used there in that sort of main opening theme, and they're used a little bit sporadically throughout. But one thing that trumpets are great for is adding high-end detail to your horns, as well as adding sort of call and response melodies, or just adding a little bit of high-end detail to your mix or your orchestration. They're not really the power of the pack, they're more of the supporting instruments again. Of course, I highly recommend taking the MIDI that I will have available for download in the link below in the description, and placing all this MIDI into your own session, playing around with it, and learning what you can for yourself from the orchestration. There's only so much we can go over in videos, and there's only so much that I can explain per orchestration, so I highly recommend downloading that, looking at all of it. You will gain a lot more information. Moving further on into the track, we find the brass used a lot more in only the more emphasized sections. Of course, the main reason for this is that brass is an extremely powerful instrument. It's not soothing, really, unless you have sort of a lyrical brass library to use, or if you have like a solo brass library to use that is just kind of soft. Generally, brass is used where you want a little bit more power, as well as just a little bit more emphasis on something, such as this section here. So we hear the brass gives that a lot of power, a lot of emphasis, and again we hear those high-end trumpets coming in and adding in a bit more detail, a bit more movement to our orchestration. So it's very, very important to make sure that you're using your whole orchestra. Now we're going to move on for the brass. We're not going to spend too long on our percussion because our percussion is very, very simple, believe it or not. Generally, a lot of more professional scores you hear, the percussion is not that extremely difficult to replicate or to examine. Of course, for our drum-based percussion, we just have our timpanis here and our bass drum, and in some sections you'll actually find the timpani and the bass drum playing together, and you will find that this gives the section a lot of a sort of a marching feeling. Of course, in tandem with the snares that are playing underneath it, it really helps solidify this sort of marching theme. However, generally the timpanis and the bass drums are used simply to add in a little bit of low-end percussion, and it really just helps fill out your frequency spectrum. This will also just help push your score along because it's adding in that low-end percussion, those booms, those really, really powerful impacts, What this does is if you take it out, your score just all of a sudden sounds weak. Instruments like the tuba and the double bass and the contrabassoon and all sort of your low-end orchestral instruments can't really get as low as the bass drum and even the timpani in some cases. If I were to just to take the timpani and the bass drum out, this entire section would be lacking in so much power. Of course, it still sounds amazing, but we can make it sound 2 or 3 times better by just adding these instruments back in. Right? They fill out your frequency spectrum and they add in a lot of low-end beef. Now, of course, as any orchestral sort of composition, we have cymbals and gongs and snares and all that. Cymbals are generally just used for marking the transition of your sections. If you're going into a new section, play a cymbal crash. That's kind of a general tip that a lot of composers sort of write their music by, that can be found in professional orchestrations all the way down to introductory sort of just getting into the scene orchestrations done by beginning level composers. This is something done in rock music, jazz, any sort of musical style really that has drums, because that high-end information helps the transition become a little bit smoother. And of course you have your snares, which are really, really great for adding that sort of mid-level action as well as a little bit of the mid-highs. They help just push your song a little bit. Now, something I'm kind of excited to get into is the use of the piano in this, because it's very, very rare that you get a score that is extremely piano heavy or just more piano heavy than such as this one. I actually have a few sections where the piano is sort of the main focus, which in extremely action-heavy orchestrations, it's not that common. It is very common if you look at orchestrations such as the ones done for Ori and the Blind Forest or more soft, fantasy-based orchestrations, because the piano is that kind of instrument. It is very great at giving you the softer, gentler tones. Really, when you go aggressive with it, it can sometimes be unpleasing. However, they did a great job using it here with this sort of ostinato run pattern that they used to move into the next section. And they bring this pattern back in the piano again, and only the piano really, over here, after we get sort of out of that marching section that comes afterwards. The piano is a great instrument for just adding a little bit of underlying detail to certain sections as well. As we can hear, as we go out of that second run phase, we have a few just block chords, which you can see here, that are played to just emphasize these hits. And you also have it coming in over here with these run downs in the slow end and sort of our high end detail here. And this really just gives the song a bit more texture, it gives it more detail. So once again, it is a beautiful use of your whole orchestral option. Of course, we have the harp in here as well, but the harp in this song isn't really doing a lot outside of the beginning intro area. It has these melody lines here, although later on it is only sort of rising runs that it plays. Of course, the harp is also playing in tandem with the glockenspiel and the celeste here in that little beginning intro. And then later on, the Glock and the Celeste fall out. They aren't really any pieces for them, and it's just got a couple tubular bells hit. This song is very piano heavy in its tonal percussion. And last but not least, we get down to the strings. Now, a lot of people will consider strings to be the backbone of the orchestra. They are the first thing that comes to mind when you think of orchestral instruments. You either think of a violin or you think of a French horn. I personally think of a violin first. And then, of course, nobody thinks about the woodwinds, which is why sometimes they are so often overlooked. Please use your woodwinds. Please use your woodwinds. But the strings are essentially the largest part of any orchestra. They will take up the largest amount of space on floor per amount of instruments just because they have more instruments in the string section. They are generally your largest section. However, considering their size and their position that a lot of composers put them in, the strings are very often used not as a forefront, but again as sort of a texture or just an addition to certain things. In this particular track, they do take the forefront a lot though, as seen at the very beginning of the track. And it's also seen later on in the track in certain sections where the main melody of the brass is taken out, and you actually have a very high amount of string runs and string chords that are being played. One example of this can be found later on in the track, again, where we have that iconic sort of rhythmic theme that gets played. Now, of course, the first thing you hear is our French horn. If you listen to it underneath, you have a very wide array of strings playing that same section as well. If I were to just, for example, mute a couple of these tracks that are playing that, you will find that the section all of a sudden becomes a lot weaker once again. Now, I should not have to stress the use of strings because, as I said, a lot of people view them as sort of the backbone of the orchestra. However, use your strings because they are the backbone of your orchestra. They add in so much detail and they fill out your frequency spectrum, an amazing joint operation with your brass and your woodwinds. If you use them all together, you can really make something extremely beautiful, such as this section here. Now, unfortunately, there's not really any sections in this song where the strings take a forefront again. They do a couple sections where they are in tandem with the woodwinds and help the woodwinds get their movement going, as well as the woodwinds just filling out the sort of other sections that the strings cannot and adding in that more detail. I say unfortunately, but really, I could not have figured out a better way to do it. And I have such a high amount of respect for Nobuo Uematsu, the composer of this music. He is such an amazing composer who does not get enough love and does not get nearly enough attention. Of course, I highly recommend, once again, please download the MIDI that will be available in the description below and study these orchestrations for yourself. They are an amazing study tool. You will learn so much in such a short amount of time. And download the other MIDIs that I have available for the other orchestration walkthroughs that I have done already as well. There's only so much I can explain in a video. The rest you kind of have to see for yourself, because if I were to do an extremely detailed breakdown of all of these orchestrations, I would have videos that are hours and hours long, and I really just would have no life outside of editing them. So please download the MIDI. I hope you guys found this information a little useful for how to use your different sections to make something similar to this or something different from this even. I hope you learned that you need to use your woodwinds. I hope that you guys stick around for our next composition walkthrough, which we will be releasing in a couple weeks. Until then, see you guys next week, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.